You have suspected that the Institute still exists. It's true, but it's not the whole truth.
I know some of the other divisions have suggested we just cut off all contact. That would be a mistake. We can't just give up on these people. And with the Android program, we'll soon have the capabilities to deploy androids to the surface in great enough numbers to maintain order.
We are here to help. Sean's been kidnapped.
Whoever took your kid had an agenda.
Ensuring that mankind has a future. This man named Kellogg kidnapped my baby. He was working with the Institute. He gave them Sean. We have no desire to interfere in the details of your personal freedoms.
Beneath the Commonwealth, there is a cancer, known as the Institute.
The Institute is the best hope for the future.
I hope you're right.
With Liberty Prime on our side, that'll give us a hell of an advantage. Rest easy. Know that the future is looking bright.
This is not a recap of the Institute or its lore, but instead a reimagining, in order to fix what I believe is a poorly written and deeply implausible faction which doesn't work or make sense. Using a combination of historical research and creative writing, I will try to create an improved Institute and lead them to victory in one of their possible storylines. My thoughts on the Institute as it was presented in Fallout 4 are that it's a poorly written villain who behaves in a nonsensical and almost cartoonishly evil manner. It has some decent characters and moments, but these are rendered useless by the fact that the Institute has a mountain of issues, and I want to try and fix them. This video will be split into the following parts. Part 1, Rules. Part 2, Issues, which will briefly highlight a single meta issue, whilst mostly focusing on lore and world building problems. Part 3, Inspirations for the changes I've made. Part 4, Reimagining. And Part 5, Conclusion. Just like my previous two videos reimagining Fallout 4 factions, I only have one rule. The rule is that my reimagined Institute must be recognizable as the Institute, a group run by scientists and focused on the advancement of scientific research and facing the challenges of the post-apocalypse. However, I wanted to add some nuance to the Institute. They talk about themselves as the last chance for mankind, and so I wanted to create a faction which has more diverse outlooks and options, and thus the player will have choices that affect what direction the Institute goes in throughout the story, with the faction having a variety of possible endings, some good and some evil. So there is only one meta issue I want to bring up: the Institute laser weapons being weaker than pre-war designs. I have fixed this with the Institute Technology Overhaul V2, which adds loads of new weapons and items. On to lore and world building. The main reason that the Institute doesn't work is in its lore and world building issues. I've identified 6 reasons why I think this is. The first and greatest reason is that the Institute lacks any kind of grand strategy or end goal. According to them, their plan is in their motto.
Mankind redefined. It's catchy, isn't it?
But it's just that, a motto. It doesn't contain any goals, tactics, or methodology, and even worse, it has no meaning. They could kill everyone by turning them into super mutants, or they could use their technology, like teleportation, to deliver life-changing aid to the afflicted and impoverished. Both redefine mankind, but the first is genocide, and the second is noble. The Institute's only major goal is Phase 3, the activation of a fusion reactor to solve its power issues. However, the only reason they want to do this is so that they can keep doing what they were doing before, more research and experiments. It won't radically alter the course of the organization's priorities, or even make its position more secure. Some members of the Institute want to help people on the surface, but most want to let the Commonwealth die so they can capture the wasteland and mold it to their ideas. The second major issue is their attitude to research and science. Scientists don't just wake up and decide to research for the sake of it. They will usually have some kind of problem that needs to be solved, and new technology is required for this. For example, the telephone was invented to improve the range and speed of communication. The mobile phone after it was created to make the improvements portable. Everyone having a phone within an arm's reach further improves the speed whilst adding accessibility. Antibiotics were invented to reduce disease, trains to improve the transportation of goods and people. I could go on forever. However, in the Institute, scientific advancements are treated more like pet projects. The technology is without a doubt amazing, but so much of it serves little to no purpose. The giant gourd project isn't being researched to solve a food crisis in the Commonwealth or even the Institute. They just want to see if they can do it. The Institute teleportation grenades don't serve any real purpose, as the Institute can teleport with pinpoint precision anywhere in the Commonwealth.
I just want to talk to you.
If I wanted to talk, I wouldn't be in here. Now just go away!
Okay, look, we're out of time here. Institute, this is Dr. Thompson. I'm sorry, I'm gonna need a synth relayed to my coordinates offset by 5.3 to subdue our subject. I appreciate your help with the situation outside, but we have to get this man back to the Institute.
The synth gorillas don't solve any kind of problem. They were made simply to see if they could. While this technology is amazing, it doesn't contribute to the goals of the Institute in any meaningful way. The third issue is that the Institute fails to understand or address its weaknesses. Its military power is abysmally weak due to two factors: their isolation and their enemies' poor organization. The Institute is isolated underground, meaning that it doesn't have to fight for its survival. Its enemies are limited to small bands of railroad agents who typically operate alone, or settlers who are poorly armed and organized. Because of this, its military forces are more geared to internal security style of operations, rather than dedicated armed campaigns. In instances when the Institute does have to deploy large numbers of synths, it does so haphazardly, with no regards for tactics or strategy, leading to massive casualties. Its internal security focus is appropriate given the types of enemies it faces and its dictatorial nature, but this focus on internal security and overwhelming numbers would become completely worthless when the Brotherhood of Steel enters the Commonwealth, as they act more like a traditional military and are essentially a foreign invasion. Each synth that is destroyed in mindless wave assaults is a loss of materials and a tactical setback, as they will take time to replace. These issues could be fixed by recruiting outsiders with strategic knowledge or by using mercenaries, but they only ever hire Kellogg, and they use him like an assassin or an enforcer rather than as the nucleus of a more robust military force. The fourth reason is that there is significant tension between the different divisions. They argue and squabble with each other over preferential treatment and access to resources. We see this tension as soon as we meet Justin Ayo, acting director of the SRB, who is talking about using courses to threaten fellow colleagues.
I am seriously thinking of heading over to robotics to knock some heads together.
What now?
They're dragging their feet on the targeting package upgrades I asked for. Maybe I should take some courses with me. Send a message.
Please don't. There's enough friction as it is between us and pretty much all the other departments.
You going soft on me, Alana? My methods get results, and they will this time as well. You'll see.
This kind of inter-service rivalry and competition is toxic and would eventually lead to a complete breakdown in cooperation, which would ground the Institute to a halt. This happened to Imperial Japan during the Sino-Japanese War and World War II. The Imperial Japanese Army and Imperial Japanese Navy were in a rivalry to gain control of the government cabinet and more material for their respective theatres, the Army in China and the Navy in the Pacific. This rivalry was so intense that the IJA developed its own naval units, and the IJN developed its own army units due to the distrust. Reason 5 ties into the previous entry. The Institute has terrible leadership. The previously mentioned Ayo is a confrontational bully who turns to violence at the slightest provocation. Madison Lee doesn't respect Father's decision to build Synth Sean, but is unwilling to do anything to prevent it, despite all her fellow division leaders being against it. Ali Fillmore, who is the soundest leader, frequently subordinates herself to others, making her sound mind a moot point. Father, however, is by far the worst example of leadership. He is power-hungry, demands submission and loyalty whilst doing nothing to earn it, and he refuses to listen to the advice and wishes of his colleagues on the Directorate.
The Institute cannot survive without leadership. The Directorate must continue to govern with the best interest of all in mind. To that end, I am naming my mother as my successor.
Oh, boy.
You can't be serious!
Really?
Seems a poor choice.
How can you possibly justify this? She isn't one of us. She isn't even a scientist.
Ignoring your borderline, insubordinate tone, I will simply say this. The Institute has enough scientists. What it needs is a leader. I believe my mother has already proven herself more than capable in that regard.
He is a sociopath, viewing his own parents' death as collateral damage, and the sole survivor's freedom as an experiment.
Your father. He never got to see you grow up.
Yes. What happened to him was... I've gone over the records of the incident, of course. It seems what happened to him was an unfortunate bit of collateral damage.
So it was you. You let me out?
Yes. It was my decision. Certainly it was no longer necessary to keep you suspended. I suppose I wanted to see what would happen. An experiment of sorts.
Father also shows a complete lack of coherency in regards to his views. He asks the sole survivor if they can love Synth Sean.
Do you think you could love him? Like you would a real boy?
However, if the sole survivor shows mercy to the synths at Bunker Hill, lets them go free, and tells Father, he will say the following.
I made a choice. I let the synths go free.
Why? Why would you do something so stupid?
They were afraid. They didn't want to come back here.
Afraid? They're machines, artificial, they're incapable of being afraid.
According to this view, synths are no different from inanimate objects. You can't really love an inanimate object. You can love people and animals, you can enjoy an inanimate object, but you can't love them because they can't reciprocate the connection. Father's lack of coherent views extends to other technological advancements made by the Institute, such as the cybernetics program. Father shuts this down because he feels the Institute is about preserving humanity, and that cybernetics and cyborgs are a bizarre amalgamation. This makes no sense, as the technology provides huge benefits to health and life expectancy. This belief is more in line with Brotherhood of Steel philosophy. The sixth and final reason why the Institute doesn't work is their tactics and methods are barbaric and ultimately counterproductive. They kidnap, murder, and replace Commonwealth citizens for their experiments. This creates an issue that everyone is equally at risk, regardless of whether or not they oppose them. This would make the Institute a threat that's impossible to ignore, and groups with nothing in common would set aside their differences to oppose what is to them an existential threat to their lives, and they would fight ferociously to win, as if they don't beat the Institute, they'll be dead anyway. This is a concept described by Sun Tzu as death ground.
A useful concept comes from the Samuel Griffiths translation of Sun Tzu, which talks about death ground. What's death ground? It's when your enemy puts you on death ground, which means they're going to kill you. And therefore, you have no choice but to fight. Because if you don't fight, you're dead. And even if you fight, your odds are poor, but at least that's the only way you're going to get out.
To me, these 6 issues highlight that the Institute is not a technocratic research organization focused on the advancement of science. In reality, it is a totalitarian dictatorship with a scientific veneer to mask its authoritarian methods and genocidal ideology, a lab coat instead of an iron gauntlet. To first get an idea of MIT's history and purpose, I found and watched these 2 videos, which were made to celebrate the 1-century anniversary since the university moved from central Boston to Cambridge. They showed how MIT gained clout and popularity by focusing on practical and industrial science, which is something I want to emulate. In order to get a good idea of how science and government policy interact, I read these 6 books, written by professionals in their fields, focusing on a variety of topics from international law, research ethics, intelligence gathering, and the history of these topics. With my desire to reimagine the Institute in a way that allows the faction to be compatible with good and heroic choices, I needed to understand how scientific research is conducted and how policymakers interact with scientists and the information they provide when writing new laws. Universities, Stakeholders and Social Missions was a particularly good read and covered how universities can be a catalyst for creating a framework for practical research and problem solving, as well as bringing different groups together to help with the research and implementation, regardless of whether they are students, scientists or lawmakers. The best part of this book was the history of a term called action research and its creation by psychologist Kurt Lewin. In simple terms, it's a simultaneous process of doing research, taking action, and critical reflection. The purpose of this was to effect organizational change and keep an organization grounded in practical problem solving. The best part about this, other than providing a good inspiration for keeping my reimagined institute focused on practical problems, is the fact that Kurt Lewin coined this term in 1944 whilst working as a professor at MIT. And as the point of divergence between our timeline and the Fallout timeline happened in the 1950s, Lewin and his work is technically canon to Fallout, and thus using it could be classified as law-friendly. Technocracy and law highlighted specific mechanisms for accountability, as well as defining how scientific and technocratic experts are given independence whilst keeping them accountable. The book also highlighted how distrust of institutions by the public can compound over time, specifically mentioning how distrust of the Japanese government in Korea and China over the handling of the Fukushima disaster fueled distrust among Japanese citizens. Thus, my institute will need to build trust with its various partners in order to facilitate its goals. Technocratic politics explicitly discusses the risk of attempting to depoliticize politics in favor of a system of leadership scientists, described as technocratic hegemony. This would weaken accountability and scientific output, as it would reduce oversight, discussions, and reviews. Eventually, this would result in the inverting of the social order, where politicians are led by unaccountable advisors who themselves are uninformed, as there are no accountability mechanisms to peer review research. This book was excellent for highlighting my problems with the Institute and how it morphed into a dictatorship. Therefore, my institute will need specific divisions and oversight between leaders, policymakers, and researchers. My institute would still need a way to defend itself, as the Commonwealth is a hostile place. To provide me with information of how spying can be conducted in an ethically conscious manner, I read Principled Spying. It discusses how spying is naturally an unethical action, but might be conducted in a responsible manner by having the missions be as limited as possible in scope and approved by an ethics committee who are held accountable by elected officials. Limiting the scope of my institute's military and intelligence apparatus is therefore vital. Before beginning, I want to point out 3 things. First, I am giving dates to events that don't have defined dates within the game. Second, the mods don't perfectly reflect my vision for my reimagining, but do a good enough job of giving my thoughts visual representation. Third, I had to rewrite major portions of the game's main story to make my reimagined institute work, so it may feel a bit quest-heavy at points. On October 23rd, 2077, civilization as we know it would come to an end. Repeated failures by the Chinese military to repel US forces from mainland China prompted a nuclear confrontation which came to be known as the Great War. In Cambridge, lecturers, students, administrators, and maintenance staff sheltered in the basements of the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, one of the United States' most prestigious universities. Once the dust had settled and the fires burned out, the surviving members of CIT would emerge from their shelter into the wasteland that would eventually come to be known as the Commonwealth. Like others, the survivors of CIT would set about trying to establish themselves in this new world. Unlike other survivors, however, their education and grasp of biology, robotics, and other advanced knowledge would quickly allow them to get a head start, gaining large amounts of resources and some new members. In 2110, the CIT survivors decided to stop doing odd jobs around the wasteland and instead began to organize their efforts to rebuild the wasteland through scientific research and technological advancement. This group called itself the Institute. Rather than rebuild the ruins of CIT, however, they began to dig down under the ruins and construct a purpose-built HQ which could accommodate for all their needs. As the Institute became more established, it restarted research projects from the pre-war CIT database and also began new projects which could help to account for the organization's weaknesses. The most pressing issue that the Institute faced in the early days was a shortage of personnel. It had to pay large amounts of money to hire people outside the organization for scavenging and manual labor. The answer to this was the Robotics Division's synth program. In 2121, the Robotics Division created the first generation of synth, a skeletal android that was able to perform manual labor with relative autonomy, as well as carry out basic security duties under human supervision. However, the first generation synth was still seen as needing improvement. In 2164, the Robotics Division had created the second generation synth. These machines had more sophisticated central processors, more durable components, and a vaguely more human appearance. But for the increasingly curious and perfectionist Institute, this was still not enough. In 2178, the Institute's governing council, the Directorate, began its third generation synth project by approving the creation of an FEV research program under the control of bioscience researcher Dr. Frederick in order to create organic synths. This marked the start of the Institute's turn to dark and cruel methods of research. In order to test its strains of modified FEV, the Institute resorted to kidnapping Commonwealth citizens and exposing them to the virus. Even members of the Institute would be experimented on if they committed crimes. These test subjects would turn into supermutants, and when the Institute had finished collecting its data, it would dump them on the surface, creating the Commonwealth's supermutant crisis. However, by 2224, the FEV research program had ground to a halt as the Bioscience Division was unable to get reliable results from its captives due to their DNA being too badly damaged by radiation exposure. But thankfully for the Institute, Dr. Frederick, now the head of bioscience, had a solution. The Institute had learned of the location of Vault 111, which contained pre-war US citizens who had been kept in cryogenic stasis by the Vault-Tec Corporation as a part of its series of sociological experiments across the wastelands of North America. In 2227, the Directorate approved of Dr. Frederick's solution and authorized its notorious and violent mercenary, Kellogg, to lead a team of researchers to Vault 111 and kidnap an infant child by the name of Sean, in order to use his DNA for the foundation of the third generation synths. The operation was a huge payoff, and by 2228, the first third generation synth had been created, the culmination of 5 decades of work. However, the sense of triumph was unfortunately to be short-lived. In 2229, an unapproved test mission to send a third-generation synth to Diamond City and have it blend in with the local populace ended in a mass shooting with several fatalities, including the synth, when it malfunctioned and began killing bystanders. Guards struggled as the assailant survived shot after shot and mercilessly slaying anyone within range. When it did finally die from its injuries, it was hardly a cause for celebration. The guards examined the corpse, only to discover that the assailant hadn't been human. This synth was nothing like what they had seen in the past. Rumours spread across the Commonwealth like wildfire of human-looking infiltrators working for the Institute, and the slaughter would come to be known as the Broken Mask Incident. The Institute attempted to mitigate the damage to their reputation by increasing their presence in the Commonwealth. In 2245, it began working alongside the leading figures in the Commonwealth to create a provisional government. This provisional government would have been able to improve dialogue between the Commonwealth's various powerful interests and unite the region. However, the reality was far more disappointing. Conflicting and even rivaling interests began almost immediately. Settlements and minor organisations in the Commonwealth's major regions would attempt to organise, but none would see lasting success. Various coalitions, committees and pressure groups would be established, reorganised, dissolved and re-established in an endless performance of political theatrics. The Institute's patience was beginning to wear thin, but it would be a seemingly small incident at the entrance of Vault 81 that would rapidly accelerate events. In 2265, a drifter working as a temporary Brahmin hand for a private caravan trading at Vault 81 is approached by a stranger and shot in the head at point-blank range. This man, as it would turn out, was not a man at all, but instead a synth, who had been travelling the Commonwealth at the express orders of a directorate to gather intelligence on an increase in surprisingly sophisticated escape attempts by Gen 3 synths from the Institute. The synth spy had been following leads to confirm the existence of a group which had dedicated themselves to the liberation of all Gen 3 synths, as they viewed them as sapient life, deserving of self-determination and freedom. The death of the synth spy would only delay the Institute from learning of the group's existence by a few months, and soon they came to know their newfound enemy by name. They called themselves the Railroad. The Directorate refused to let this organised resistance to their work go unpunished. They formalised their intelligence efforts by creating its dreaded secret police force, the Synth Retention Bureau, focused on policing any resistance to the Directorate and its increasingly isolationist and self-interested policies, whether in the Commonwealth or the Institute itself. In November 2266, SRB forces would attack the Railroad's HQ and kill its founder Agamemnon, and whilst this would be a setback, it failed to destroy the Railroad, which would go on to reorganise. This failure to outright destroy the Railroad would anger the Directorate, and led to it cutting off its effort to aid with the creation of the Commonwealth Provisional Government. In May 2270, a synth representative would enter the meeting of the Commonwealth regional leaders, as had happened many times over the previous 2.5 decades. Instead of taking their seat, however, the synth drew a pistol and killed everyone present at the meeting. This violent end to the efforts of forming a provisional government announced to everyone that the Institute had given up on helping the surface and instead would turn inwards and focus on its own advancement. Attacks on locations like University Point would only reinforce this idea that the Institute was now an openly hostile force. However, this rapid change in diplomatic course would have unintended consequences for the Directorate. Institute scientists became aware of the massacre of the CPG after leaks by SRB staff who were against the operation, and they began lodging formal complaints against the Institute's new isolationist stance. Scientists began staging protests by refusing to work, intentionally working slow, and distributing anti-directorate pamphlets. The Directorate, convinced that it was just a small minority, chose to implement harsh crackdowns. Personal living spaces, labs, and computers were searched for anti-directorate leaflets or messages. This, however, would only escalate the situation. The protests grew in size, and individual scientists would begin small fights with coursers who attempted to search their rooms and labs. Almost all of these fights would end in the scientists being detained, but occasionally, a courser would be critically damaged and need significant repairs. The tension was palpable, but it would be a miscalculation by Dr. Frederick that would push this situation into open rebellion. Dr. Frederick, by this point in his late 80s and a long-standing member of the Directorate due to his success in the Gen 3 synth project, had become suspicious of Sean. Sean had been raised his entire life in the Institute and was something of a local celebrity due to his DNA being the basis for all third-generation synths. This relation to the synths was more than just genetic, however, and Sean had developed friendships with several synths, herein laying the foundation of Dr. Frederick's suspicion. Since the start of December 2270, Dr. Frederick had been working with the SRB to try and find the person behind the escape attempts, but had turned up no leads until November 2271, when he discovered that Sean had been attempting to determine whether or not third-generation synths were sapient. Sean had been working with Alan Binet, the head of robotics, to covertly scan new synths' neurological developments to see if they were capable of developing their own thought patterns. Dr. Frederick, in an effort to sabotage this study and give himself the opportunity to find more evidence on Sean's involvement in the escapes, told Sean that more of his DNA was needed for new experiments into synth production. Sean, unaware that he was under suspicion, agreed. This process normally involved injections to increase the number of stem cells in Sean's blood over a 7-day period. However, Dr. Frederick gave Sean 5 times the standard dose. His intention was to keep him bedbound and unable to cover his tracks, whilst the SRB conducted a more thorough investigation. However, this would backfire spectacularly. Over 4 decades of giving DNA for synth development had wrought havoc on Sean's body, and unbeknownst to anyone, he had developed cancer as a result. This latest injection by Dr. Frederick exploded his undetected cancer's volatility, resulting in it mutating rapidly before spreading from his blood to his heart, lungs, brain, and kidneys. This would cause his health to rapidly deteriorate, and 3 weeks later, in January 2272, he died. The death of Sean saw a wave of mourning sweep over the Institute. Even third-generation synths would mourn, though in private to avoid persecution. It was soon discovered that Dr. Frederick had been responsible for Sean's death, and was under the direction of the SRB. Violence erupted. At first, it was large-scale vandalism of SRB personnel's private living quarters and damage to Corsa weapon lockers. In March 2273, however, a massive, well-coordinated attack took place. Synths and scientists fought side by side and attacked several key locations. SRB personnel were completely overwhelmed as an angry mob descended on their division and broke the doors open with modified plasma grenades. Meanwhile, another team of attackers broke into the director's private quarters, assaulted them, and used their private terminal to disable the Gen 1 and 2 synths that were assigned to guard duty. Those who had remained loyal to the Directorate, including Dr. Frederick, acting head of the SRB Justin Ayo, Lawrence Higgs, and the former director, were arrested and held prisoner to ensure they couldn't escape. By the end of the day, the rebel scientists and synths had taken full control of the Institute, created a provisional administration, and had released all of the SRB's files on Institute personnel. The provisional administration met the following day to discuss the Institute's future. Whilst all agreed that reform needed to take place, none could agree on the scope of the reforms and what should happen to those that had remained loyal to the Directorate. The Institute, looking for inspiration on how to restructure the organisation and prevent any component entity from accumulating too much power, began reactivating old computers and salvaging books from the ruins of CIT. They hoped that they could learn of better methods for administrative power and accountability, whilst reorienting the Institute to solve some of the problems it had created. The research bore fruit, and the Institute became aware of the works of Professor Kurt Lewin. Whilst they were over 3 centuries old, the methodology for research, practical action and critical reflection became the basis of the Institute's new organisational structure. This new structure, which promoted oversight and accountability, ethical consideration and practical research, was given the name the Lewin structure, and was given practical form by following the classical 3 pillars of government structure. The Directorate, representing the executive branch, is elected by scientists of the Institute and acted as a sort of higher council which could propose laws to the heads of faculties and make quick decisions during a crisis. It also had the power to establish oversight committees. Oversight committees make sure that the Institute's various branches and projects were in keeping with the ethical considerations and that there was no abuse of its resources. The heads of faculties represents the legislature and is styled as a unicameral body. Each faculty represents one of the Institute's branches and has 3 positions: the lead administrator, assistant administrator, and dean. Only members of that branch can vote for its 3 representatives, and the lead and assistant administrators cannot participate in voting for the dean, who is seen as a direct representative of scientists and prospective students in their branch. The heads of faculties can propose laws and pass them into power by popular vote, and like the Directorate, can also establish oversight committees. The Ethics Committee represents the Institute's judiciary. The Ethics Committee's role is almost entirely oversight. It will establish oversight committees whilst also being responsible for conducting and maintaining ethics investigations should serious accusations of wrongdoing be made or suspected. It will conduct these investigations in liaison with members of the Directorate or heads of faculties in order to maintain impartiality and objectivity. Its members are elected by a combined vote from the heads of faculties, Directorate, and among the Institute's population, but one can only stand for election to the Ethics Committee after undergoing a 6-year training process and must mediate and resolve at least 7 ethical cases. Even if a prospective Ethics Committee member cannot pass the high bar to attain the position, they can become a skilled ethics investigator within a branch, and will rotate between branches to ensure a varied and dynamic knowledge base and skill set. The Institute has also expanded and added several new branches to its structure in order to explore new fields of research and create more robust mechanisms for development. Advanced Systems is focused on cutting-edge energy research and is responsible for weapons production, improvements to the electrical supply, and the maintenance of the molecular relay. Robotics is responsible for producing Generation 2 and 3 synths, recycling Gen 1 or badly damaged Gen 2 synths, and the reactivation of pre-war military robots to either bolster the security operations branch or sell to responsible third parties. Bioscience is responsible for maintaining the supply of genetic material used in the production of Gen 3 synths, as well as producing medicine and food through botany, agricultural research, and training doctors. Facilities has been expanded and turned into engineering, which is tasked with the maintenance of all Institute facilities, but has recently begun major research and construction projects exploring durable, long-lasting infrastructure, which could be the key to expanding Institute facilities and rebuilding the Commonwealth. The first of the new branches is education, which is responsible for educating the Institute's youth and providing additional education to new recruits or those specialising in a particular field. It also manages the Commonwealth Joint Education Programme, which sponsors schools throughout the Commonwealth and provides a basic education to children on isolated farmsteads. The Psychology branch has several wide-ranging projects, including leadership and ethics training, mental health and addiction recovery programs, and Gen 3 synth psychology and neurological studies. This latter project was started in honour of the deceased Sean and has made incredible breakthroughs, such as the discovery that third-generation synths are intelligent enough to develop their own neural pathways and develop their own thoughts, leading to the Institute declaring Gen 3 synths as sapient in 2275. I will address this further in a moment. The History branch is responsible for the recovery of pre-war legal and scientific texts, archaeological studies of the ruins of pre-war buildings, and the recovery of pre-war technology. History has also begun to recover other pre-war items, such as music recordings, fictional books, and other forms of entertainment for communal use within the Institute. The finance branch's primary duty is making sure the Institute maintains a balanced account book, which it does by training accountants and is responsible for allocating material resources, paying mercenaries and labourers on the surface, and investing into surface schools or startups with promising scientific potential. It collects money from investments into private scientific initiatives on the surface, as well as donations and tuition fees from those wealthy enough to pay for an institute education. Finance is heavily monitored by the heads of faculties, who have the final decision on whether a project is invested in or not. Security operations is the final institute branch and is responsible for guaranteeing the safety and security of institute personnel and facilities. Security operations is subject to heavier oversight than all other branches due to its role as an armed force and intelligence service. Any use of force or restriction of someone's liberty must be backed up by correctly obtained, good quality evidence. Inside the Institute's HQ, its role is as a police force and will use non-lethal measures such as stun guns and flash grenades. Outside the Institute's HQ, it will establish staging areas for scientists prior to the start of their projects. It must get approval from Ethics Committee representatives if it wishes to start an intelligence gathering or military mission against perceived threats, and must be able to articulate why it believes it is necessary and provide an accurate scope of the mission. Failure to do either of these can result in immediate suspension or termination. Due to its security-minded focus, it will also be responsible for initiating diplomacy with any relevant parties, and for maintaining and defending aid distribution points throughout the Commonwealth. Security operations is the most likely branch to use outside help in its operations, and uses veteran mercenaries to train its various synths for combat, and, in some cases, even hires mercenaries to act as tacticians or take command of small strike teams. Despite this use of mercenary advisors, the Institute has largely been unable to reorganize its security forces away from internal security to military operations due to the nature of its organization and the threats in the Commonwealth. In order to build positive organizational cohesion and prevent toxic competition between branches, as had been encouraged under the old leadership, many of the Institute's research programs or manufacturing efforts are actually joint projects run by a group of 2 or more branches. Such examples include the previously mentioned third-generation synth production, which is run by the Robotics and Bioscience divisions, but also receives technical assistance from Advanced Systems for the manufacturing of the advanced chip interface, which is placed in the synth's brain. The Advanced Systems maintenance of the molecular relay is done in collaboration with engineering. Education and psychology routinely form joint education programs for leadership training, and all branches that require work to be done on the surface will collaborate with security operations. The collaborations and joint projects go on and on. In 2274, trials for those loyal to the old directorate took place. The incredible scope and quantity of the evidence against Doctors AO, Frederick, and the former director was breathtaking. Even though SRB had destroyed several servers in an attempt to conceal its crimes from the rebels, thousands of files were still recovered, including kidnapping, murder, and replacement of Commonwealth citizens. AO, Frederick, and the former director were sentenced to death by the unanimous vote of the new directorate, ethics committee, and heads of faculties. Lawrence Higgs, however, had not committed any major crimes and hadn't been involved in the decision-making process of the directorate, as he hadn't been a member. He was found guilty of thoughtlessly carrying out blatantly cruel and invasive policies, and, in a show of leniency, was sentenced to 12 years in prison and a lifetime bar from voting in any elections. In 2276, when the restructuring of the Institute was complete, its new director, Ali Fillmore, would order a broadcast to the Commonwealth that the Institute had been internally restructured and those responsible for its previous crimes had been removed from power. The new Institute would return to the Commonwealth and try to rebuild its relationship with the inhabitants. The period between 2273 and 76 became known as the Second Founding, and the period between 2265 and 2273 became known as the totalitarian era. The true dividing point between the old and new institute was the completion of the third-generation synth neurological and sapience test in 2275. This test was conducted on 500 synths who had displayed desires to escape the institute and other free will-like behaviors, and concluded that synths were capable of forming thoughts outside of sanctioned coding and neurological parameters, and thus were sapient. However, this led to more questions than answers. What should the role of Gen 3 synths be within the Institute? Should they be allowed to leave the Institute? Do they get a say in how Gen 3 synths are manufactured? The strongest proponent for unconditional synth freedom was Alan Binet, head of robotics. He argued in the strongest possible terms that as the Institute had definitively proven that synths were sapient, they had the right to learn, research, vote in Institute elections, and leave the organization if they wished to. This was seen as unacceptable to Max Locken, another high-ranking robotics scientist. He argued that synths were just machines and didn't have free will, no matter how intelligent they seemed. He stated that he would not budge on this issue no matter what evidence was presented, and this threatened to grind the heads of faculty's decision-making process to a halt. It was Clayton Holdren who bridged the divide and created a temporary agreement that everyone could accept. Gen 3 synths who were students or researchers were allowed to vote and have a partial say in synth manufacturing, but were not allowed to leave the Institute as their capture or destruction would represent a serious setback to Institute technological development. Travel to the surface could only be done as part of working for the Institute. This agreement became known as the August Compromise, as it was passed into law in August 2275. The Institute returned to the surface in January 2277 and immediately set about trying to improve the dire situation the Commonwealth was in. Security operations deployed several teams to attack large supermutant camps. At the same time, security operations coordinated with bioscience to establish aid distribution centres and field hospitals, as crop yields in the previous harvest had failed and the Commonwealth was experiencing a famine. The education branch began sponsoring Diamond City's school and science centre. Engineering began expanding Institute facilities on the surface. This included rebuilding the ruins of CIT and Greentech Genetics. This was done for two reasons. The first reason was to provide a forum for technological demonstrations and act as another way for aspiring scientists to join the Institute. The second, and arguably more important reason, was to make the Institute feel more visible and approachable. This was important as the heads of faculties and the Institute at large had voted Ali Fillmore to the Directorate on her pledge to restart the process of creating a Commonwealth provisional government. Whilst this was a sound move, the policies of the previous directorates quickly began to rear their heads. The first was Kellogg, the Institute's former surface operator. In July 2277, he escaped being apprehended by security operations at Fort Hagen and killed several highly trained Gen 3 synths and human mercenaries. The second was Synth M762. He was one of the last synth doubles sent out before the second founding. He had made something of a name for himself under his guise of being McDonough and had become a local politician. With security operations busy trying to locate Kellogg and railroad agents, they saw no need to expose and arrest him. However, this decision would backfire as McDonough went on to win the mayoral election in 2282. By this point, the Institute had established a certain degree of trust with the Commonwealth, and removing McDonough now would make it seem like they had never given up on secret manipulation tactics. These failures had a profound effect on the politics of the Institute and served to manifest political blocs within the heads of faculties that had existed unofficially since the Synth Sapience tests. Unlike the surface, the Institute didn't have official political parties, as such things were seen as unnecessary to an organisation of relatively little size. However, such divisions were natural, and the Institute came to have four major political blocs. The first was known as the Realignment Movement, led by Max Locken. It was staunchly anti-synth freedom, and wanted to return to the policies of the previous directorate. Several of its thought leaders, such as Lawrence Higgs, were barred from participation in the political system for their loyalty to the previous directorate, even after learning of its crimes. Its fringe views on leadership style, foreign policy, and several of its thought leaders being unable to run in elections or vote has meant that the realignment movement has been relegated to a meagre third place in terms of support and size. The General Alliance is a large catch-all group of students and researchers who just want to focus on the development of the Institute's science and infrastructure in order to rebuild the Commonwealth. This bloc is nominally led by Ali Fillmore, but as the duties of director take up much of her attention, Clayton Holdren has become seen as its leader within the heads of faculties. Due to this group's general focus on Institute projects and expansion, something that everyone is generally on board with, it commands the largest presence within the heads of faculties and can easily count on an influx of support for more generalized legislation. The Committee of Technological Advancement, typically referred to as a CTA, is led by Alan Benet and is the key proponent of unconditional synth freedom and spends much of its time arguing for increasing the rights of synths and their involvement in the Institute's decision-making and research projects. Several synths have achieved positions of notable respect within and with help from the CTA, which has served to bolster the bloc's credibility greatly. The CTA does its best not to lose sight of practical goals and solutions, whilst maintaining its idealistic and egalitarian outlook, and for this reason, it is the second largest bloc within the heads of faculties. The fourth and final political bloc is the rather unusual transhumanists, led by Rosalind Orman. This group believes that the Institute, and in particular synth technology, is the key to improving every facet of human life, from health and longevity to strength and intelligence. This group swings wildly and frequently between supporting the realignment movement and the CTA. The former it supports in matters of jealously guarding the Institute's technological advancements from the outside world, whilst the latter it supports whenever they propose ambitious new research projects or when one is at risk of being closed down, particularly those that could advance synth technology. Whilst the transhumanists is small, it has at times been the difference between a piece of legislation passing or failing. Their most prominent moment as power broker was their supporting of the August Compromise, which they did in exchange for the General Alliance and CTA agreeing to the restarting of the Institute's cybernetics research project. As these blocs act more like points of view rather than traditional political parties, conformity to supporting a particular bloc is not present. The majority of representatives within the heads of faculties will typically vote in support of legislation from two or more groups. This is not frowned upon by the bloc they nominally represent. However, the Institute was not without some success in its return to the surface. By 2279, engineering and bioscience had successfully rebuilt CIT and green tech genetics and integrated them to their operations. Security operations had also achieved some success in reaching détente with the railroad. The railroad had seen the growing influence of the Institute due to its aid and outreach programs, and had become increasingly concerned as they had failed to increase their own reach since the death of Wyatt in January 2273. The railroad tried to counter the Institute's growing popularity by expanding the Shadow War. Between 2278 and 2281, assassinations, bombings, heists, infiltrations, and escapes would undermine the Institute's early rise. This led to an increasingly grim casualty count as civilians became increasingly caught in the crossfire. In 2281, a railroad bomb detonated in a drifter camp near Diamond City, killing over a dozen civilians. Pinky Thompson was just as shocked by the carnage as the Institute and the Commonwealth citizenry. So when agents from security operations extended an offering for mediation talks, he seized the opportunity. Although he was not able to negotiate freedom for all Gen 3 synths, he was able to secure a significant deal. The Institute and Railroad agreed to no fighting near aid distribution points or in major settlements in an effort to reduce civilian casualties. As a sign that the vastly more powerful Institute would keep its word, Pinky Thompson was able to convince them to release a dozen synths that wanted freedom. Although détente with the Institute gave the railroad time to rebuild and increase its strength and presence, the deal made Pinky Thompson incredibly unpopular, and he would resign in 2282 to maintain the railroad's cohesion. The final project of note in the Institute's return to the surface was its failure to rediscover Vault 111's location, which had been lost during the rebellion due to the SRB destroying several of its servers in an attempt to conceal its crimes. The project had been running since 2280 and had been the main focus of the History Branch, who were seeking to free the Vault's sole remaining occupant, who had been left trapped in order to provide a backup option for uncorrupted DNA. However, the project had majorly overrun on costs, resources, and deadlines. The heads of faculty had continually voted to extend the project despite the lack of success, but in 2285, the General Alliance dropped its support for the project, citing an increase in counterfeit Vault 111 material, and Finances was unable to continue supporting the project, and it ended that same year. In 2288, the life support systems of Vault 111 would finally break down, and a fail-safe measure would release the Vault's only remaining resident, the sole survivor. The sole survivor made their way to Diamond City and would begin their search for Sean by speaking with Piper and Ellie and searching for Nick Valentine. Once Valentine had been freed, the pair returned to Diamond City and the sole survivor learned the name of their son's kidnapper. Nick explained that Kellogg's employment as a mercenary had always been to a secret employer, but he had disappeared in 2276 and the Institute had been hunting for him ever since. They both theorized that the Institute was hunting him to tie up loose ends. The pair decided to search Kellogg's old house in Diamond City, but when they broke inside, they were surprised to find Q142, a synth working for security operations. Whilst Q142 was initially startled by the pair, they didn't take hostile action against them. Q1 stated that he was hiding in Kellogg's house, hoping to ambush him if he returned, and whilst it was technically a violation of his orders, he was willing to let Valentine and the sole survivor search the house. The pair found no further clues and prepared to leave defeated, but before they did, Q1 told them that the rest of his team was camping near Fort Hagen, led by a mercenary called David. The pair reached the security operations staging area near Fort Hagen. They spoke with David and told him that Q1 had told them how to find him. David was initially hesitant to enlist their help, but relented after being told about Sean's kidnapping. David stated that several other teams and individuals had gone missing, and several civilians had reported sightings of an elderly scarred mercenary. The pair began investigating the leads that David had provided, travelling across the Western and Central Commonwealth. Eventually, the sole survivor and Valentine tracked down Kellogg and killed him in January of 2289. The pair were able to find Kellogg's personal possessions, including a broken Institute computer, before David and his team arrived and took away Kellogg's body. Nick suggested taking Kellogg's broken computer to Dr. Amari, who was familiar with advanced computer systems. She was unable to fix it, but told the pair how to find the railroad. Tinker Tom was able to dismantle the computer and gain access to its information, most of which was fragmented. From this, the sole survivor and Nick learned that Kellogg had been working for the Institute, further entrenching their belief that the Institute's hunt for him was a cover-up, and that they still had nefarious goals. Nick, Piper, and the sole survivor discussed how to break into the Institute to get Sean back. Nick reminded them that the Institute's surface bases were just additional facilities, and that no one knew where their true base was. Piper suggested that the sole survivor could infiltrate the upcoming scientific summit held next month by the Institute in the CIT building. The sole survivor managed to gain entry to the summit at the CIT building. Whilst inside, they witnessed Commonwealth citizens displaying their scientific theses and inventions with the hope of either securing funding or joining the Institute. The sole survivor was able to slip into staff-only rooms near the back of the building and witness the key to the Institute's security. An Institute scientist stepped into a side room, and after saying the words, "Request relay access to HQ," he teleports and disappears. The sole survivor attempted to access a nearby computer, but found themselves unable to break the encryption. The sole survivor returned to Diamond City and discussed their findings with Valentine and Piper. Piper suggested paying another visit to the railroad to see if they could help with hacking the Institute. The sole survivor told the railroad about the need to hack the Institute's computers, and they tracked down a copy of the Institute's Code Defender software, which all their security systems were based on. Before the sole survivor could return to CIT, the Brotherhood of Steel arrived in the Commonwealth and launched a preemptive strike against CIT and Greentech Genetics. Several dozen Gen 1 and 2 synths were lost in delaying actions, allowing the Institute scientists and Commonwealth citizens to escape. The Brotherhood captured several pieces of technology, including Institute computers, before returning to Boston Airport. After aiding Paladin Dance and gaining access to the Pridwin in March, the sole survivor was able to covertly hack into a captured Institute computer, reconnect it to their network, and copy files relating to the construction of the molecular relay. The only difficulty was that it required access codes that could only be found in specially coded synth chips. The only way to get one would be to kill a member of the security operations and take theirs. In May, the sole survivor joined a railroad ambush on a newly established security operations staging area. However, several civilian casualties by railroad agents drove a wedge in cooperation between them. The sole survivor built the signal interceptor with help from the Minutemen remnants in Sanctuary. Once inside, they were greeted by Director Fillmore and learned of the Institute's history and their son's role in freeing the Institute from the corruption of its totalitarian rule. It was a lot to take in, and the sole survivor was not wholly convinced, but Director Fillmore gave the sole survivor unrestricted access to the Institute. They could walk wherever they liked and speak with anyone they wished. This privilege had never been granted to anyone who wasn't a member of the Institute. The sole survivor wandered the Institute's many laboratories, speaking with both human and synth scientists, learning how Sean's death had sparked the rebellion that ended the tyranny of the previous directorate and laid the foundation for partial synth freedom. The General Alliance and CTA were incredibly happy that the sole survivor had been able to escape Vault 111 and find their way to the Institute, whilst the realignment movement was noticeably unfriendly to the sole survivor's presence and demanded that security operations limit their movement. The transhumanists were more enigmatic in their welcoming, speaking of the hopeful prospect of life-changing research that could be accomplished if the sole survivor would support them. Once the sole survivor had finished acquainting themselves with the Institute's staff, they returned to speak with Director Fillmore, who asked if they would be willing to give the Institute a chance, despite its previous failings. The sole survivor was unsure about the Institute, but stated that they would keep an open mind. When the sole survivor had come to terms with the information they'd learned, they spoke again with Director Fillmore, who requested they help security operations with an ongoing mission in the Commonwealth. Security operations was investigating a series of ambushes and attacks, possibly committed by railroad operatives in the Western Commonwealth. The sole survivor's experience with the railroad made them an invaluable asset, and the security team eagerly followed their lead as they investigated several likely hideouts in the region. In early June, the Institute discovered the railroad cell whilst it was packing up to relocate. The Institute ambushed them, and with their superior small unit tactics and cutting-edge weaponry, were able to destroy the cell entirely. Once the location had been secured, several kidnapped humans and synths, all Institute personnel, were discovered brutally executed. This barbarity was outside of the usual methods of the railroad and prompted further investigation. Once the sole survivor returned to the Institute, they spoke with Director Fillmore, who informed them that security operations was preparing an expansion of its counterinsurgency effort to respond to the shocking escalation by the railroad. However, before the sole survivor could reach the Office of Security Operations to begin assisting them, Alan Binet approached and spoke with the sole survivor. He had recently become aware that his son Liam had been recruited by the railroad and had been helping to coordinate escapes as well as pass information to the outside world. Alan stated that his son was willing to act as a mediator and establish a meeting between the railroad and Institute to discuss the unusual escalation. The sole survivor agreed to bring this to Director Fillmore's attention in an effort to avoid additional violence. In mid-July, Liam was able to organise a meeting between Desdemona and Institute diplomats. Desdemona was shocked. The targeting of non-military forces was strictly prohibited under her leadership, and the manner of the killings was unusually brutal. When the sole survivor described the appearance of the cell's leader, Desdemona immediately knew who it was, and explained that she had exiled one of her agents who had been caught using terror tactics. After he left, a handful of members from various cells in the Central and Southern Commonwealth had defected to help him. The Institute delegation continued to discuss the violence, new prohibitions, and the arrival of the Brotherhood of Steel, which concerned both groups, as despite their differences, the Brotherhood of Steel viewed them both as a threat for their involvement with Gen 3 synths. The violence between them had achieved little, and the threat of the Brotherhood proved to be a unifying theme. Desdemona agreed to a total ceasefire, in exchange for the Institute promising to go further with Gen 3 synth freedom. Alan Binet and Director Fillmore leveraged the announcement of the ceasefire to easily pass the Ascension of Synthetic Life Act in October 2289. This saw Gen 3 synths gain equal status with human members of the Institute. They could now become NCOs and intelligence officers in security operations, branch directors and project leaders, and had limitless freedom on choice and movement. However, the optimism and hope from this success was overshadowed by the Brotherhood of Steel laying waste to Goodneighbor. The Brotherhood had launched an attack on the railroad's HQ in November 2289, but it was repulsed and the railroad escaped. In retaliation for their failure, they turned their weapons on a more visible target. Goodneighbor's large ghoul, free synth and sentient robot population had always been seen as a blight to the Brotherhood, and eager to score an easy win in order to hide their failure, they attacked the town. Goodneighbor's guards were quickly overrun, and civilians were executed en masse, both on the streets and in their homes. The only residents who survived were those who had been away from the town at the time or escaped during the early minutes of the attack. The Railroad and Institute knew that the destruction of Goodneighbor, as the event came to be known, was only going to be the beginning if they didn't destroy the Brotherhood. But whilst the Railroad were masters of subterfuge and the Institute had advanced technology, neither had the knowledge of military-scale warfare or logistics which would be necessary for defeating the Brotherhood. But they knew where they could find it. The Minutemen remnants, whilst far from recovered, had rebuilt a decent base of support in the Northern Commonwealth and attracted many former Minutemen to the area, saving their military knowledge. In January 2290, the three groups agreed to form the Commonwealth Coalition in order to defeat the Brotherhood. Minutemen set to training Institute security operation teams, turning them from policing units into soldiers. Railroad spies began a massive intelligence gathering operation, attempting to learn any weakness that the Brotherhood might have, and the Institute began manufacturing weapons, armor, ammunition, and rations like never before. The epitome of this great effort was the Commonwealth Coalition 1st Battalion. This battalion was made up of 1,000 fighters from all three organisations, and although its early months were plagued with infighting and supply troubles, it would go on to distinguish itself as the most premier fighting force in the Commonwealth Coalition. The two sides spent 3 months skirmishing, and although these engagements were small, everyone could tell that a decisive battle was right around the corner. Unfortunately for the coalition, it was on the Brotherhood of Steel's terms that the battle would be fought. In April 2290, the Brotherhood learned that the location of the Institute's HQ was under the CIT building and deployed Liberty Prime to act as the spearhead of the assault, despite being unable to find more of its Mark 28 bombs. The Coalition was forced to fight in costly delaying tactics as they prepared themselves for a proper confrontation. The Coalition used Gen 1 and 2 synths as distractions in two ways. The first was intentionally deploying them in isolated or hard-to-defend locations, so when Brotherhood fighters attacked, they would be baited into rapidly closing the distance, where the synths would detonate concealed explosives at their location, destroying themselves but being sure to take the power-armoured paladins and knights with them. The second was to teleport them behind the advancing Brotherhood force. This would force them to stall as they would have to halt to re-secure their back lines and prevent encirclement. The Minutemen committed the last of their artillery units to the fight and were able to deal significant damage before being forced to abandon the weapons as vertibird response teams swooped in. Railroad snipers blocked flanking positions and forced non-power armoured soldiers to seek cover, slowing the advance. The Institute deployed its new shock troop units. These were highly trained and well-equipped soldiers, most of whom were Gen 3 synths. They used advanced armour and weapons and fought with unrivaled resilience, knowing they would be shown no mercy by the xenophobic Brotherhood. However, Liberty Prime couldn't be brought down, and it continued its advance towards CIT. Repeated attacks by plasma rockets and EMP mines failed to inflict any meaningful damage and would only force the machine to halt for short periods of time. The Coalition was forced to repeatedly fall back, but once they reached the same street as the CIT building, they knew they could fall back no further. The Commonwealth Coalition 1st Battalion covered the retreat of friendly forces across the bridge at Ticonderoga Safe House. However, Ticonderoga itself was not ready. The 1st Battalion, despite orders to continue falling back, refused and held the bridge. They fought to the last man, but blocked the way forward for 30 minutes, just long enough for the Institute's newly formed electronic warfare team inside Ticonderoga to activate its new weapon. Weeks earlier, the Railroad had found that the Brotherhood was assembling Liberty Prime, and whilst they couldn't prevent it, they were able to learn what frequency the machine's AI operated on. The Institute used this information to prepare a supercomputer-based device that would wipe Liberty Prime's previous instructions and give it a new order: destroy the Pridwen. Liberty Prime slowly turned its gaze from the road ahead, looked towards the Pridwen, and charged its laser. The Brotherhood watched helplessly as their flying fortress was blown out of the sky. The Brotherhood War was over. With the destruction of the Pridwen, Brotherhood forces were scattered, and the fate of the Commonwealth was forever changed. The Coalition, despite all the odds, had succeeded, and this success saw the emergency alliance of former enemies blossom into a permanent alliance of friends and equals. A provisional government gave way to elections, and a democratic republic was formed, guaranteeing freedom, prosperity, and progress for all. The sole survivor, who had suffered and lost so much, found peace with the death of their son, and would continue to work with the Institute. Their knowledge of pre-war events, technology, and day-to-day life provided the history researchers with an endless stream of discoveries and insights. Piper maintained her suspicious attitude towards the Institute for several more years, but would eventually become satisfied with their evolution, and, somewhat ironically, would go on to be the author of their most successful recruitment campaign. Valentine too would eventually drop his suspicion of the Institute, and go on to approach them for significant repairs. With his brand new, custom-made body, he would continue his life as a private investigator, and even the most hardened criminals would cower in fear of the unstoppable synth detective. Garvey would continue working as a military advisor and trainer for the Coalition and later Democratic Commonwealth governments. The Minutemen were a thing of the past, but several idealistic squads of soldiers would co-opt their iconography and rhetoric, ensuring that memory of their sacrifices lived on. Dance would fortunately survive the attempt on his life by Elder Maxon, and although he would remain suspicious of the Institute and later Commonwealth governments for the rest of his life, he was at least sensible enough to work with the Commonwealth Republic to help encourage the remaining Brotherhood soldiers that were stranded in the Commonwealth to demobilize and disarm, successfully limiting further violence. In 2299, Elder Maxon tried to re-enter the Commonwealth to recruit former Brotherhood soldiers to undermine the Commonwealth Republic, but was caught and executed as a war criminal. With the passage of the Ascension of Synthetic Life Act in the Institute, the Railroad had gotten what it wanted, freedom for Gen 3 synths. Its remaining members would all part ways in 2297 after a handful of successful sting operations against anti-synth gangs in the Commonwealth. Railroad operatives would mostly retire from militant activities, but occasionally would volunteer to train new generations of Commonwealth Republic intelligence officers. Several of these new generation intelligence officers would get tattoos of the railroad lamp as a symbolic continuation of their teachers' ideals. With the Institute firmly in the public spotlight for helping save the Commonwealth, they were able to remove McDonough from power without any kind of public backlash in 2294. His removal from power had two positive effects. Firstly, it revealed he had been secretly supported by members of the realignment movement, who were subsequently removed from their positions and imprisoned for supporting an enemy of the Institute, further diminishing the movement's legitimacy. Secondly, ghouls who had survived the destruction of Good Neighbor were able to move back into Diamond City. This influx of people revitalized the city's economy, and it would recover quickly from the effects of the Brotherhood War. The Institute further reformed itself. In 2301, the General Alliance was absorbed by the CTA, which had become the dominant political bloc after the success of the Ascension of Synthetic Life Act and the later execution of Elder Maxon. The newly named Alliance of Technological Advancement was elected by a landslide to oversee the transformation of the Institute into the Commonwealth's Technologist Forum, or CTF. This saw the Institute transfer the finance and security operations branches to the young Commonwealth Republic government. The remaining branches were split into their own independent educational and research entities, with a CTF liaison facilitating cooperation between them. Now a series of universities and research labs, all retaining the Institute's structure and leadership style, they focused themselves on building synths and providing education, seeing the Commonwealth become a bastion of technology, societal development, and economic power. And so it was that the sole survivors and Institute's legacy came to an end. The Institute that had set out to redefine mankind was not the same one that had accomplished it. Whilst the Commonwealth would become a shining beacon of civilization, fighting would continue in many places throughout the wasteland of the old USA. Because war never changes. Thank you for watching to the end. This video was complex to research and create, so a like and subscribe would be a huge help. How do you think the story would have ended if one of the other blocks within the Institute had come out on top? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'm also going to be streaming on the 21st of December with my friend Ladybird Scribbles, where we'll be doing world building, writing, drawing, and discussing future videos. I'm going to be releasing a video where I lay out the future of the channel. It'll be more of a rough guide than a roadmap, but I should have it out by the end of the month or early January. Thank you for watching and have a great day.